Great. So while I'm doing a talk today that is called Make the Internet a Better Place, I actually do truly believe that the internet is an awesome place because there's a website for everything you could possibly ever need. Like no matter if you're looking for financial advice, cooking recipes, how to assemble your furniture, or you simply want to look at cat pictures, the internet got you. Unfortunately, not all of us. Because a lot of those amazing websites are not letting everyone in. They are shutting people out. And this is because of this little thing here, cookie banner. Guess all of you have seen a cookie bar before, right? So cookie banners are those little windows that are popping up when you enter a new website for the first time and they tell you something about their cookie usage. And usually they say something like, this website uses cookies to improve your experience. By using our website, you agree to our use of cookies. But what a lot of those banners could equally say is something like, if you have Parkinson's disease, this website is not for you. Please go somewhere else. Or, if you're blind, this website is not for you. Please go somewhere else. So, they don't really say that though, but this is what a lot of those banners actually do. They don't let someone who has Parkinson's disease or is blind using their website. And this is because how a lot of those banners work is they kind of block the rest of the website. So you can only access and interact with the rest of the content of the website when you are clicking on this Yes, I accept button. And that's the problem. You have to click on it with your mouse. But someone who has Parkinson's disease would most likely not use a mouse because they usually have some chronic pain in their hands, so it would be very painful for them to use a mouse. So what they do is they use their keyboard instead to interact with the website. Same goes for people who are blind. They don't see the screen, they can't use the mouse because they don't see the cursor, so they use an assistive technology called screen reader. And this is reading the content of a website out loud to them. So they're listening to the content and then they're using a keyboard to interact with the screen reader. So all of them are basically relying on keyboard usage, but a lot of those banners really only work when you actually click on the Yes, I accept button. So you can't get past this. And even if you get past this and you access the actual website, it mostly just gets worse because the internet is really not accessible. There is an initiative called WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind, that is conducting accessibility audits on the top 1 million most visited homepages every year. And this year they found that 96% of those websites are not truly accessible for people with disabilities. So only 4% of the internet is truly accessible for everyone. It's just not really a lot. So whose fault is that? It's not necessarily the internet's fault, because the internet itself is built upon tools that are accessible by default. It's our fault. Like everyone here in this room who has ever been involved in creating, designing, developing a website has most likely contributed to the internet's accessibility problem. I for sure did a lot. Hi, I'm Larissa. I am a web developer. I've been with Thoughtworks now for almost 4 years, been developing different web applications for them, for different clients. And before that, I've been working as a web designer. And during those years, mostly in the beginning, I made a lot of websites inaccessible to a lot of people. This is an example. This is a piece of code I've written myself a few years ago. And what this does, it removes all focus outlines from all buttons of the website. Focus outlines are those borders, those little borders around interactive elements that show you where you currently are on the website, which element you're currently focusing on. And these are really important for people who are relying on keyboard usage, because that's the only way they can determine where they are currently at the page. Because when you use your mouse, you would see your cursor moving around and you know where your cursor is, you know where you are. When you're using your keyboard, you're using your tab key to go from one interactive element to the next. So from button to button, from link to link. And this focus outline shows you where you currently are and with which element you can interact with. So really important for everyone relying on keyboard usage. And with those 3 lines of code, took me basically 10 seconds to write it. I made the website I've been building at this moment completely inaccessible for everyone who relies on keyboard usage. I didn't do that on purpose, just because I didn't know better. I'm doing better now, promise, not doing stuff like this anymore. So let's learn from my mistakes. But before we do that, you might ask, why do I even want to make my website accessible? That sounds like a lot of work, right? So the reason is because there are a lot of people that require this. This is not a small minority. According to the World Health Organization, in 2023, there is 16% of the world's population who experience some form of disability. So this is 1 out of every 6 people in the world. So for me, the best argument to make a website accessible is it's because it's simply the right thing to do. We want to be nice people. We don't want to exclude people from the internet, which is such an important resource for every one of us. And I guess as you're all here joining a talk called Make the Internet a Better Place, I guess that's almost argument enough for you. If not, I have 2 more arguments for you. Argument number 1, money. Those 16%, they are also your potential customers. They have money they would like to spend on the products and services you're offering. But they can't if you don't make your website accessible. So an inaccessible website is usually also a revenue loss for you and your company. Argument number 2, it's the law. Depending on for which region or country you're developing your website, there's most likely already a law in place, or there will be a law coming in the next years that requires you to make your website accessible. For example, in the United States, there's already the Americans with Disabilities Act in place, for which Beyoncé, for example, got relatively famously sued for because her website was not very accessible to blind people. In Europe, there will be the European Accessibility Act coming in a few years that will require most of public websites like e-commerce websites to be accessible. And even if you're developing web applications, not for the open internet, like for example, you have a company and this company requires an internal application for only their employees, this is also most likely regulated by a law. For example, in Germany, where I live, there is the German Participation Act, which requires companies to hire disabled people. And this also implies that the tools that you use internally in your company, like web applications, are accessible to them. So in the end, there is simply no way around it. You have to make your website accessible. And the good news is, when I was saying that it's our fault that the internet is inaccessible, what I also mean with that is that it's completely in our power as technologists to change that. And the even better news is, it's not that hard. You don't have to learn a new crazy tech stack. You don't have to abandon your familiar ways of working. You just have to use the tools that you're already using properly. And I'm going to show you 3 simple steps how you can start doing this right now. So let's do it. Step number 1, know how to use a browser. Okay, I know this doesn't sound exactly mind-blowing. Everyone here knows how to use a browser and how to navigate a website with a browser, right? Yeah, Anna says yes, yeah. Not exactly. I mean, we all know one way usually how to interact with a website, the most convenient way for us. So for me, for example, I use my mouse and I use my cursor to click on different elements, and this is how I navigate a website. Because as we learned before, this is not the only way how you can interact with a website. And as we're not building websites for only ourselves, we should make sure that we test it in all different interaction ways you can interact with a website as the user of your website. And roughly, there are only 3 of them. So first, as I already said, you can use your mouse. Second, you can use only your keyboard without a mouse. And third, you can use some assistive technology, mostly a screen reader, to navigate the website with that. And kind of all assistive technologies rely on the same interaction pattern as a screen reader. So, and I think as web developers, we should be so familiar with all of these three interaction ways that it feels completely natural to us to test our features that we're currently building with this way. So I believe how most of us are developing applications is we write some code, we build a feature, and at some point, eventually, we go to the browser, we test, is this working, what we're currently building? And this is something you shouldn't just test in the way that's most convenient for you, but always in those three: mouse, keyboard, screen reader. And if this is something familiar to you, this will only take you a few minutes. It's not something that will completely disrupt your current workflow. So this is something you can easily start doing right after this talk. If you're not familiar with all of these three interaction patterns, just go to your favorite website and try it in a different way than you usually do. And you will get familiar with that in no time. And with that, we're already at step number 2. Use HTML properly. So I don't know if you ever saw one of those memes or joke, but there's this thing going on in the internet, like the nerdy part of the internet, where developers are making fun of people that say HTML is a programming language. Because most developers don't consider HTML a true programming language because it's a plain markup language. You cannot do a lot of like crazy fancy logic with it, like talk we saw from Daisy with like Carbon or Rust. You can't write crazy complex logic. So not a programming language. I'm not getting myself into this debate. I don't really mind how you classify this, but I think this meme and a lot of those jokes show a lot how developers, or most developers, view HTML as something not complicated enough to really spend time on it. You don't really read documentation. You don't really like do like a full HTML course because you can make it work anyways. And that is a really sad thing because when it comes to accessibility, HTML is really your friend. Because when you use it properly, it's accessible by default. It takes up a lot of work from you. And this is because of semantic HTML elements. So in HTML, there are 2 different categories of elements: semantic elements and non-semantic elements. And these semantic elements are the accessible ones because they carry a purpose and a context with them that they convey to the browser. For example, if I would use this semantic button element, this would tell the browser, hey, I'm a button, and users can interact with me. And then the browser translates this for different interaction patterns and say, okay, this is something where users can click on, where users can interact with their keyboard on. And also a screen reader would recognize this element and would read out to a screen reader user, this is a button, and you can interact with it with using those key combinations. So really handy, really easy to use, and completely accessible. On the other hand, we have the non-semantic elements, which don't carry any context with them. They're just empty containers. You can put anything inside, but the browser wouldn't know what it is. So fun fact about HTML, there are currently 115 different functional HTML elements you can use. Only 2 of them, you can see them here, are non-semantic. Still, this non-semantic div element is the element I see mostly used on websites. And this is because it's a little bit of a trap. Because those div elements can be really handy, because when you style them properly, you can achieve anything with that. At least it looks like you do. So if, for example, it doesn't really matter if I use the semantic button element or I just use a plain div to create a button, with some styling, I can make them look exactly the same. And then you might think, okay, job done. I've did a button with a div, amazing. But accessibility-wise, this is not a button at all. Like with this button element, there comes a lot of accessibility stuff that is just not there. It's not usable with a keyboard. It's not usable with a screen reader. So first advice is, whenever you can use a semantic HTML element, do it. And you will be surprised how many of them are there. But I guess some of you will already say, no, okay, but that's not enough. There are some use cases where I can simply not use a semantic HTML element. And that is a really fair point. Especially with the growing complexity of web applications, we cannot do everything with semantic HTML. We sometimes have to build our own custom components using mostly diffs. And that's fine, because when you truly understand how HTML works, you can rebuild the accessibility behavior with a non-semantic element, because there's everything there in HTML that you need. So when we stay with our button example here, I show you how to make this work with a div. So what I would usually do when I would use a semantic button element, what I want to do is that there is some functionality. When the user interacts with it, some cool stuff happens. The only thing I have to do when I'm using the semantic button element is I add an on-click functionality, and then I add like the cool stuff that will happen. And then the browser will translate this for us for like, this happens on keyboard usage, this happens on screen reader usage. For the div, this is not there, so we have to rebuild this. So there are a few things we have to do. The first thing is we have to add some context to our div, so the browser actually knows what is this element. And we can do this with so-called ARIA attributes. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Application, and it's basically a set of HTML attributes that helps you to provide more context and accessibility for your elements that you customly build. And one of those ARIA attributes is a role. And we can use this role to like add some meaning, what this element is, to a new element. So here I'm using the role button, and now the browser and also screen reader knows, okay, this is a button element, and I can also announce this to the user in that way. But this is currently only a promise what this element is. It does not add any functionality. So we still have to build this ourselves. So the second thing we have to do is adding our div button element to the tab index. The tab index contains all the elements that are focusable with a keyboard that you can interact with. So usually when you like navigate through a website and you're using your tab key, you go through all the elements that are within the tab key, within the tab index. And the semantic button element would be automatically recognized from the browser as something that will be added to the tab index, so it's reachable by keyboard. For the div, it wouldn't, so we have to specifically add it with just adding this tab index equals 0, and then it's in the native tab index, and a user can reach it with their keyboard and can focus on it. The next thing is the same thing we do with our semantic button element. We want to have something happening on clicking, so we add an on-click functionality. But now, as the browser doesn't really know what this element is, this really only works on clicking with your mouse. It's not translated like for our semantic button element. So we also have to make sure this also works for keyboard interaction. How I would usually like interact with a button when I only use a keyboard is I use my space or my enter key. So I specifically have to add this here to the div with doing the on key down functionality. And then I can basically define in the method which keys should trigger my super cool interaction that will happen. So I would do something on space and enter. And the last thing we have to do is we have to add a focus outline around it. This is also something that comes natively with the semantic button element, but here we just have to add some styling. So we have this little border around it to make sure that people know they're currently focusing on this div element. And that's it. With that, we made a non-semantic element completely accessible just with the power of HTML. So if you really understand HTML and unleash the full power of it, you can make it all work and make it all accessible, no matter if semantic element or not. You just have to understand it. Okay, and with that, we're already at our last step, step number 3, test multiple ways. And what I mean with this, it's not enough to just test for accessibility in an automated way. So you might have used one of those things before, a so-called accessibility scanner, these automated scanners, because they're getting really popular right now. And those scanners are usually like either already built in your browser or you can install them, and they're really nice to use because you basically just go to the website you want to test and you click on scan or test or start, And then it will scan your entire website for accessibility issues, and it will give you this percentage, like the accessibility score at the end. And this is also a trap because these scores tend to be very high, so you feel very confident, but it might be that your website is still completely inaccessible. I saw a lot of those scans with like 100% accessibility score while the website was still completely inaccessible. And this is because how those accessibility scanners work. Because the fun thing is they also need some kind of accessibility to scan the page. Because what they do is they also look for semantics. They basically would look, is there a button element? And then they check, has this button an accessible label or are there the right attributes? But when you're just using divs without any additional semantics, they wouldn't even know that this is an element. So they don't check for it. They just ignore it. So yeah, that's a bit of a trap. I'm not saying don't use these. These things can be a really nice start to start looking for accessibility into your website. They're really good in checking example color contrast or checking your markup if you're using attributes right. So it's a good thing to do, but you shouldn't just rely on it as the only thing. You should always have to do manual testing as well. So you have to put in some manual testing work to make accessibility work. But you can still include this in your testing pipeline or your usual way of testing in writing tests for accessibility. And I'm going to show you an example of one of my latest projects. So I'm currently working in a design system. We're doing a lot of custom components for our client. And lately we had to do a tab bar. I think every one of you knows what a tab bar is. You have multiple tabs, and no matter which tab you are, you see then different content. So here basically what you would do, you would go from posts to stories, and then you see different content. And it doesn't really matter what exact tech stack you're using for your test, but I believe what most of you would do when you write some web application, you write some kind of test to test this component's functionality. So what I did is I wanted to make sure that this custom built component works in a way that the active tab is changing. So that basically when I go from posts to stories, then the stories tab is active. So what I did first, and I guess what most of you are doing, doesn't matter the exact testing framework or tech stack, is I write a test and check changes this active tab item on click. So I write something like it should change the active tab item on click. Then I'm simulating a click on the tab, and then I'm just checking, okay, is the tab item that should be active now? So with that, I can be pretty confident, okay, my tab works in that way. When someone clicks on it, I have the proper tab active. Okay, but as I mentioned multiple times now before, clicking on something is not the only thing. How you can use this, and so why not test for both? Because it's not more work. So how would someone use a tab bar? When you're using only your keyboard, is you usually use your arrow keys to go from tab to tab. So when I want to go from posts to stories, now I use my right arrow key to navigate to this. And I can easily test for this as well with basically the same test. So I just copy and paste this, and I do two simple changes. I change the name of the test because I want to test something differently. Now I'm testing, should change the active tab item on arrow key press. And then instead of simulating the mouse click event, I'm just simulating an arrow key event that I'm pressing on the arrow right key. And then I'm just checking again, is the right tab item active? And this is basically not more work. You just copy and paste, change 2 lines of code. And with this, you already have a test in your testing pipeline that can make you way more confident that this component is accessible for different users. And this is just a little bit advertisement here. This is just the beginning. You can do a lot of accessibility-driven component testing. So if you're interested in that, there is the Tech Radar, and we have a very nice part of the Tech Radar that explains a little bit more how you get into this accessibility-driven component testing, also about how to access different parts of a screen reader. So you can go to this and read more about it. But here we're already at our end. So these are the 3 steps I would recommend to you. First, navigate websites in the 3 different ways: keyboard, mouse, and screen reader. Use native semantic HTML whenever possible. And if not, make sure you rebuild the accessibility behavior of a semantic component. And step number 3, always perform automated and manual testing. And if you're going home today and you go to your next website project and you do just one of those things, I promise you, your website will become a little bit more accessible. And if we all together here do all of those things, we really can make the internet a better place, at least a more accessible one to everyone. Thank you.